welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. With you, as always, your host, Irina Zuckerman. For those newly joining the show, I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today, we have a special guest, Ella Rosenberg, who is an EU regulatory consultant at the FIC&Co, and she'll explain what that means in a minute. And we'll be touching on a topic that has almost disappeared from the headline thanks to the more traditional state level rivalry, great power competition with Russia and China, which is the topic of terrorism financing. It's not that terrorism stopped or the terrorists stopped financing, it's just that we stopped talking about it. But upon looking closer, just as our own methods of counter intelligence are evolving with the emergence of new technologies, so is the methods of funding terrorist operations. We'll find out why that is, how exactly it works, and what we should be watching out for amidst our concerns with various wars or potential conventional warfare in different parts of the world momentarily. Ella, thank you so much for joining us. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into this interesting area and what that means exactly? What do you do?
Well, first of all, Irina, thank you so much for having me. And if I may say so, good afternoon from Tel Aviv to everyone. Essentially, this line of work, I tend to say that karma wanted me into this, but essentially it is a very long process of trial and error of how I worked into this specific field. I actually did not anticipate myself working in this field. I started my studies in European law, Maastricht University in the Netherlands. I did my bachelor there. I then continued to a master in commercial and company law in Rotterdam, also in the Netherlands. And when I came back to Israel in 2018, I found it very peculiar, the fact that no one was very interested in European law and the European regulatory framework. It came to a level that if you asked people in Israel what is the difference between a regulation and a directive, they didn't have a clue of what it means. What is the difference between a regulation and directive? And slowly but very surely, I started working in that field. And because the issue of cryptocurrencies at the time has been very new, very innovative, and licensing was very scarce, specifically in Eastern Europe, I started working in licensing of cryptocurrencies and EMIs in that area. And then it gradually worked itself into Western Europe. And because if you look at the issue of licensing of cryptocurrencies, because it has a lot of implications of defense, it has a lot of implications of AML, it has many implications when it comes to terrorist financing, also in the fields of maritime cargo and art, I finally made my move specifically into those fields. And currently that is what I work in specifically. So my day job, if you want to define what my day job is, I'm an EU regulatory consultant here at the firm of FIC&Co. And specifically, I work in the fields of banking, AML, CTF, defense, also cryptocurrencies and fintech. But when it comes to other types of work, which is more in depth and more considered high risk, it's also the notion of prevention of human trafficking, art, and maritime cargo. And I mainly work in the fields of, in the geographical areas of Europe and the Gulf. So if you want to work or if you want to operate between those two specific geographical areas, I'm your go-to person.
So I can imagine that the frameworks, regulatory frameworks in those two parts of the world are quite different. How do they manage to get along, especially in recent times when crypto has become such a big avenue for, how should I say, fleeing Russians and others of their ilk to basically bring their financial wealth to a safe place?
Well, you need to bear in mind that first you need to define what is the issue of cryptocurrency. How do you define cryptocurrency? Is it a service? Is it a commodity? Is it, as I said, is it a service? Is it a commodity? My sister joked around a while ago saying it's a derivative. You need to, first of all, define what it means exactly as a notion. And each country has defined it differently. The European Union has taken a very strict approach in that. So they published MiCA, which is the European regulation of cryptocurrencies, how to regulate it to a very specific extent. It was published around a month ago after it was approved a while back. But the road to MiCA was not an easy one. So if you look at the era before MiCA, pre-MiCA, cryptocurrencies was mainly regulated under AML laws, so mainly under 6 MLD, 5 MLD, and 4 MLD. But if you look at it in a more precise manner here in the Gulf, each country is taking a very different approach. So in the Middle East as a whole, you have the state of Israel, which takes a very strict approach when it comes to cryptocurrencies. You have to pay specific taxation when you enter the amount back into the original bank account here in Israel. You have other countries that have regulated it in a different manner, such as the UAE. It really depends on the country that you work in within the Middle East, but you also need to bear in mind that the Middle East, unfortunately, is not yet an economic union. I greatly believe in the notion that the Gulf and the Middle East should be an economic union, but we're not there yet. We're not as privileged as our European counterparts. So to that effect, the Europeans have taken a very specific approach. We're not able to do that yet, as we're not in the level of a financial union.
Yeah, I'm a little bit skeptical about that, not because I'm against financial unions in theory, but in practice, when there's an economic imbalance between countries, as there is, for instance, between GCC and countries like Lebanon and Iraq, that becomes a significant problem for both countries, as I found out from even visiting EU, where such disparities are in some ways significantly less, I would say. But US has taken exactly the opposite approach of
Yes.
EU, in that there is no internal consensus on anything related to cryptocurrency. As the controversy rages on, the SEC has taken a regulatory approach to exchanges, targeting exchanges and essentially who can make the money off these transactions, which is not a bad place to start, and at the very least it gives a clear line of accountability to third parties interfering with the process and to try to crack down on frauds and scams. As we have seen, the biggest problem here so far has been a fairly large number of scammers who, as it now increasingly turns out, also benefited more globalized scams, some of them with state actors. We have seen FTX invest and exchange cryptocurrencies in all sorts of DAOs, which themselves may be parts of Russian or other operations to self-fund or to lobby. So there is that movement, but everything else is still up for grabs as far as I see. So how does it work when you have such a diversity of different options and you're trying to create a comprehensive approach towards other countries that do not have a singular mind on this matter? How do you manage to get everyone more or less on the same page in terms of observing your own law?
Well, I think it really has to do with the vision that you have for the area. I always compare this area of the Middle East to Europe in the beginning of the 40s and 50s. So Europe post-World War II was a complete and utter train wreck. It was not possible to do anything in Europe, mainly because of World War II, not mainly because of World War II. And when the coal and steel community came into being in 52, it changed. It created a spillover effect that essentially created a situation that other countries joined this community, which came into being the European Union much longer along the lines. But if you look at this area of the Middle East, yes, we have various countries with various difficulties, and we have various laws, and you need to bear in mind that certain countries observe Sharia law to one extent, and several countries observe it quite differently. Here in Israel, we also observe in certain instances and not in all instances, we also observe Jewish biblical law. So on the one hand, it can be viewed as something quite difficult to find some sort of common ground to make sure that we have a financial and economic union at the end of the day. But here comes along the Abraham Accords, which were very successful around I think it was 3 years ago, if two and a half years ago, this monumental event happened. And it gave so much hope, especially for the people of Israel. I can speak of their behalf being Israeli. It gave a lot of hope to the people of Israel, mainly because all of a sudden you're able to go to a different part of the world that you're not able to. All of a sudden you're able to work, operate, and bank with your counterparts in the other side of the world. Albeit banking has been quite problematic up until this day because we don't even have a proper taxation agreement.
Oh, really?
Between the, there's no proper taxation agreement. There's an agreement for economic collaboration. I know there's a draft for taxation, but it hasn't passed parliament yet. And today, if you want to pass funds from Israel to the UAE or Bahrain, for instance, and back, it's quite a process. It's not something that happens quite easily. So if you want to break that barrier, the first thing you need to do is to make sure you have proper banking, that you have proper banks that are willing to accept and send the money. And here comes the notion of fintech, because banks are not able or they're not willing to transfer the funds in accordance to their specific regulation. The surge of PSPs, which is a payment service provider, comes into being. Why? Because PSPs are able to transfer the funds from one state to another. And also, in certain instances, if they're an electronic money institutions defined as an EMI, they're able to also hold the funds for the client. So if you see the banking surge between the two countries, it's mainly within fintech. Also, the issue of cryptocurrencies has been risen quite dramatically because if people are not able to transfer their funds specifically between themselves in fiat currency is a regular currency, which essentially means US dollars, shekel, dinar, whatever it is. All of a sudden, they're able to transfer the funds into a cryptocurrency, whether it is USDT, Bitcoin, Ethereum, liquidated back in the UAE, for instance. And even if you look at those specific topics, the issue of KYC, which is know your customer, comes into being. Who is the person opening the account and who is he transferring the amount to? Which raises the question of terrorist financing. If you would like to finance terror in a specific region, this is a golden opportunity for you to do that. This is why the checks and balances on the banks and those fintech enterprises needs to be much more obscure and much more strict. And this is what we're dealing with specifically in the issue of terrorist financing here in the region. I can mention that from a brief, research that I've conducted in the Gulf and specifically in the West Bank and Israel, cryptocurrencies are mainly seen as something that is not, mainly touched with the regular society. Let me call it that way. It's usually touched upon with a younger audience, but also with an audience that's associated with either illicit activity or with terrorist activity. So people are viewing it with a much more stringent eye.
Interesting. I wonder whether it will change as younger generations kind of incorporate it more, but for now, it's definitely an obstacle. What has been the biggest challenge to coming to this taxation and banking agreement, given the security repercussions of not having it, not to mention the conflict? I mean, there's a free trade agreement, but on the other hand, when there's no banking agreement, does it not slow down things quite a bit?
I'll say a very unpopular opinion. It's mainly falls upon the notion of two specific entities. One entity is Bank of Israel that's being very strict with the notion of transferring, receiving, and transmitting funds to other countries that are considered high risk. And when I mean high risk, I mean gray listed under the FATF, which is the Financial Action Task Force, which is the equivalent of the UN for money laundering practices. That's one issue. The second issue that we have is the issue of our current government. Because the state of Israel did not have a proper functioning government, I think within the past 4 or 5 years, and up until I think 2 years ago, we only had a change in some sort of change in governance, but then it was taken back again around a year and a half ago. No, think it was taken back around 6 or 8 months ago by the current government. This has not been part of their priorities, and instead of focusing on how to make banking easier between the region to make sure that the economy thrives between the two nations, they're focusing on different things, but that's not the scope of this show. But as I said, I think it's a matter of a governmental issue. I know the UAE counterparts are very willing to make sure this specific issues are resolved. But unfortunately, on our side, on the Israeli side, this is something that has not been taken into consideration.
I do understand that the UAE was briefly gray listed last year due to the Russian currency situation, but that they have in fact addressed some of this in terms of their specific banking scrutiny and regulations. I don't know how strictly that is actually enforced, but in terms of regulatory framework, I do believe they have been since removed from the list for this year, but I don't know if that's accurate.
That's partially true. So essentially, the UAE has been unfortunately put on the FATF gray list around the time of February, April 2022. This has been an issue that has been troubling the UAE quite significantly, mainly because of 3 recommendations. I think the first recommendation had to do with the issue of the regulation of cryptocurrencies and liquidizing them into the bank. The second issue was the issue of money laundering and real estate. And the third issue was the fact that you have many companies in the UAE in the free zone that are not either registered properly or registered with a different UBO. A UBO is an ultimate beneficiary owner, meaning you don't really know who is hiding behind the entity. And this specific registry has been quite troubling for the FATF because they were very suspicious in their mind that you have a few businessmen from the Eastern Bloc, so mainly from Russia and Ukraine, that are hosting their activities in that area. I know that that issue has been resolved partially yet. I know they're still working on it, and there's still sessions working on the specific recommendation on the FATF. But you also need to bear in mind that the Egmont Group, which is like the cabinet of the FATF, and is also the, I call it the closed members club of all the FIUs, and FIU is a financial investigation unit globally. They're hosting it in Dubai in July 2023. So you can see for sure that there is some sort of goodwill on behalf of the FATF and the Egmont Group to make sure that the UAE will have the conditions they are rightfully so demanding. But at the end of the day, they do need to make some sort of changes, either to the legislation or best practices, and also practices in practice.
And on the part of Israel, has there been an observable spike in suspicious financial transactions since the Abraham Accords and since this greater efforts at a greater financial regional integration?
Well, it depends because unfortunately, Israelis, when it comes to cryptocurrencies, have been granted the title of scammers. To an extent, I must agree with that because we have tons of scammers based here in Israel that work in these specific fields. If you look at the operations that they conduct with the UAE, I can't say that this is very decisive, because if you think in the mind of a scammer, and if you think of him in the mind of a criminal, it doesn't really matter to him where he conducts his activities. He just needs a very easy ground to operate in. So regardless if it's in the UAE or Albania or Georgia or Sweden or Estonia or the UK, as we recently witnessed with the Milton Group scandal, it doesn't really matter for them where these operations happen. It's just they need the proper infrastructure for this to happen. Unfortunately, they have taken into their advantage the UAE regulatory framework for that, but they're not able to do that anymore because up until a few months ago, there's a completely new regulatory framework that really regulates on how you're able to move in and out cryptocurrencies in the UAE. So I think they'll have to find a new jurisdiction to operate in.
Well, scammers are bad enough, but terrorists are even more of a problem. One of the interesting, not in a good way, things that we've seen emerge over the past couple of years is the increase in bellicose activity among certain Arab groups inside Israel. And the question is, this sort of incitement probably does not come without also financial incentive. Have we seen an increase in cryptocurrency going into those sectors that hasn't previously?
Well, unfortunately, yes, because first of all, you need to define that specific group. So Israel, if you look at the Arab population here in Israel, you have two main groups. You have the Arabs living in the West Bank and Gaza, which are with a Palestinian passport, and they're considered Palestinians. And then you have Arab Israelis living here in Israel within the 67 Green Line, and they're specifically holders of an Israeli passport and an Israeli ID. So they're defined Israeli citizens, just as much as I'm defined an Israeli citizen. When it comes to their illegal and illicit operations, there has been a surge in the way they operate, especially in cryptocurrencies, because it become, very easy for them. It has become something that's very accessible for them. And it also has become something that is, I don't want to say more hidden, but this is something that can be done behind the shadows, in a sense that you don't see the cash flowing in the streets. I had a discussion a while back with some army official, and he mentioned to me, yes, we don't see cash passing around from our side to the border to the other side of the border into the West Bank. And I said, well, of course, because it's all in cryptocurrencies, what did you expect? And he was completely flabbergasted. And he said, well, but this is happening all, during COVID. And I said, he said it was happening during the COVID, when you had the specific closures around COVID. He said, and he also mentioned to me the fact that all of a sudden the financial sector in Ramallah has, increased dramatically. And I said, well, yes, because it's based on cryptocurrencies and they liquidize it there. So you do see a lot of activity that's going in and out between the West Bank and Israel, between these specific populations. The issue where it becomes very interesting is the moment of liquidation. So just as much as a criminal would like to, rob someone, or if you have a terrorist that wants to blow something up, at the end of the day, he's a human being and he has to buy milk at the supermarket. At this day and age, he can't buy milk at the supermarket with a cryptocurrency. He has to do it in this area with a new Israeli shekel. In order to get that new Israeli shekel, which is our currency here, he needs to liquidize his cryptocurrency from the current wallet that he has into the banking system. And if you know the indicators and you know exactly what to look for within the banking system, once you liquidize the cryptocurrency into actual cash, you're able to detect the transaction, and you're able to detect the illegal activity following into that. I'm aware of the fact that you have units also within the Israeli military, but also within the police that are monitoring it. But up until now, I haven't viewed a specific technology that is able to detect it either on, a preventive method and towards the future. So to view it in advance, only post-mortem. The problem with post-mortem is that it's very difficult to find the offender in that case.
Why is that such a problem?
To find the offender post-mortem, because once you do that, he's aware of the fact that the transaction has been conducted and it's on the blockchain, has been liquidized into a specific bank account with a specific person linked to that bank account. So that person can either disappear, or he can run away, or he can, close the account. He can do a billion things. But if you're able to prevent it, the smart thing in terrorist financing is to prevent it in advance. Unlike money laundering, when you have to look backwards and you have to see the transaction backwards, in terrorist financing, the smart thing to do is to view it in advance. I always compare terrorist financing taking white money, turning it into black money, while money laundering is taking black money and turning black money, turning into white money. Yes. So it's the same thing. It's exactly the same thing, but on the flip coin. And this is something that people don't understand when they're investigating this field, that you need to be very specific in the indicators, and you need to be very specific whether you're doing it post-mortem or you're doing it in a preventive manner.
So how would you figure out that, either cash or crypto is about to be used for something illegal? I mean, what do you work with other basically conspiracy experts who basically examine a network and the totality of what they do to figure that out, or are there some sort of inherent red flags in financial activity that alert to you even in the absence of any other information?
It depends on the type of intelligence that you have. So maybe our viewers are aware, or listeners, sorry, maybe our listeners are aware of the fact that you have a few types of intelligence. You have HUMINT, which is human intelligence. You have SIGINT, which is signal intelligence. And you have WebInt, which is web intelligence. So depending on the type of intelligence that you have, you're able to create the indicators for the terrorist financing. And I'm specifically focusing on terrorist financing right now and not money laundering. So when you look at the issue of terrorist financing in human activity, so human activity, you have to work with sources that tell you, well, this and this amount will trespass or will go to this and this person. This is a very difficult type of intelligence to gather, mainly because you have to make sure you have a good relation with the source that you're working with. But in addition to that, a lot of the cases, this information can be spot on, but can also be complete and utter nonsense. Depends on the creditworthiness of your source. So that's one aspect you need to take into consideration. When you're looking at signal intelligence, so SIGINT intelligence, when it comes to intercepting some sort of calls or listening to other people's calls, that's also, it's a better indicator to see what you're able to do and what not. But again, it's listening to other people's calls, and due to the recent scandals that we've been witnessing on offensive cyber, this has been on the news very, very heavily here in Israel, and I don't think any court of law here in Israel will uphold such evidence if gathered in cases of terrorist financing, unless they surpass a certain exception by law, which I won't go into that today. It's a different type of conversation we can hold specifically on transcending these calls, but it has nothing to do with the scope of our conversation today. It becomes very interesting when discuss WebInt activity. Why? Because in the WebInt activity, you're able to see, first of all, the blockchain. So you're able to view from the minting of the coin to its liquidation where it has trespassed. So it's very easy to view it. Everyone can view the blockchain. You can open it everywhere. You can see it everywhere. As long as you have an internet connection, you're able to see it. When it comes, to the level of indicators where it's being liquidated to the bank, here it's where it gets significantly more difficult. Why? Because you need to know what are the money laundering and terrorist financing indicators of the specific country you're working in and work just below them. And if you work just below them or just above them or in the proximity of, you're able to detect higher cases of terrorist financing in that specific region. I'll give you an example that I used to give my clients in Estonia. So one of the indicators to find a suspected, in this case, money laundering case at the time in Estonia was the threshold of 15,000 euros. So if you were a cryptocurrency exchange working in Estonia and you wanted to purchase cryptocurrencies in the range of 15,000, so 14,999 or 15,001, that's most likely money laundering. Why? Because it's just below or just above the threshold. So you need to check the thresholds, and from there you're able to detect, or for high proximity, if it's terrorist financing or not, in a more general overview, if I may say so.
Very, very interesting. And given the proliferation of innovation in other technologies, have you seen any sort of correlation between cyber activity, cyber crimes specifically, and crypto? What is the relationship between these two new directions of
I find it as a direct relation. I'll give you another example. My alma mater, Maastricht University, was hacked. I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, by a group of hackers. What they did, they hacked the university. I think it was databases of grades of students, and also the enrollment procedure and all of the students' data. They took it, and then they requested the university to pay a ransomware of around, I think it was 15 million or some ridiculous amount of yours in order to get the information back. So if you look at cyber attacks, one of the methods in order to get paid for that specific cyber attack is by ransomware. How do you conduct ransomware? With crypto. Why? Because it's very difficult to detect at the end of the day who receives the specific amount, because you don't know who's behind the wallet. I can open a wallet, you can open a wallet, Barack Obama can open a wallet, and you won't even know who's behind it, because there's no system that says, well, Ella has a wallet, Barack Obama has a wallet, or Irina has a wallet. Okay, you can only see it if you register your wallet on an exchange, and that exchange has your name attached to a specific wallet. But ransomware, once you deal with that, and if you do cyber attacks, you never work on exchanges, because the blockchain platform, the beauty of it, but also its a disadvantage, that it's peer-to-peer. It's not regulated under any central bank. So if I want to transfer money to you directly, Irina, I can open my wallet and send it to you, and it will be under no supervision of any central bank. Central banks only become part of this system once you liquidize a specific amount into fiat currency, so US dollar, shekel, whatever it is, or if the exchange itself is licensed by the central bank of the specific country, and then you need to send monthly reports on that. But otherwise, no one will know.
So that brings me to another question. One of the trends that we have seen in some of these ransomware attacks is that you have criminal hackers who are freelancers, but sometimes they also work with state institutions, Russia, China, Iran, who sometimes do that for their own basically funding purposes, but also to the benefit of the state actor that hired them. How often is the case with terrorist cyber exchanges that they use ransomware, first of all, for funding purposes, and second, how often does that do they hire freelance hackers to do that, or some sort of how often do you see a convergence between well-known or clear terrorist groups and other sorts of entities operating in a more gray area?
Well, this brings you to the unescapable question of how do you define a terrorist? Because you can define Al-Qaeda as terrorists, you can define Boko Haram as terrorists, you can define Hezbollah, and you can define Hamas as terrorists. Unfortunately, there are certain dictatorship regimes that you're not able to define as terrorism because they're a regime. The regime in Iran is not, well, it can be blacklisted and is sanctioned, but is not considered terror to an extent. The current administration in Russia, it's not considered terrorism. It's just a specific, government, but it can't be associated as terror, unfortunately. So what your first point, you need to define what is a terrorist. And then after what you define what is a terrorist, then if you look at the governmental level, you need to state that the regimes that you're specifically discussing, whether it is Iran or North Korea or whatever it is, a lot of their work is subcontracted, because if they work on the governmental level, they don't want to be associated with that. So, for instance, certain countries do want to be associated with the attacks that they do, such as North Korea. Certain countries do not want to be associated with the attacks that they do, such as Iran. So in that case, what they do, they subcontract the work. They usually find these specific freelancers in a very bizarre manner. It's usually word to mouth, because if you're known in the industry, they will find you. If you're a very good crypto hacker, if you're a very good cyber hacker, if you're a very good offensive cyber operator, they will find you and they will use you to their specific advantage. It is then up to your choice whether you want to work with them or not. In certain instances, they don't even have the choice. They're just told to do what they need to do. But again, these freelancers, I haven't really viewed anything specific to that effect. The only thing I can tell you that in Israel, for instance, our critical infrastructure, whether it is electricity, water, gas, all of these specific industries are monitored constantly, because they're under constant attack, both of the Republic of Iran and other countries abroad that they're trying to infiltrate the system and harm it. I'm pretty sure this is the work that's been done under some sort of freelancers in these respective countries, but this is something that's been blocked by our cyber directorate all the time.
It's interesting, the rise in these these freelancers who are nevertheless affiliated with state entities has increased in the last several years, but the international cooperation to track them down and arrest them has become more difficult, given the lack of law enforcement cooperation on the other side. But what about non-state actors like Hamas, like Hezbollah? Yes, they're technically affiliated or answerable to, or get funding from and support from Iran, but at the same time, they also have a great degree of independence in their activities. Do they also rely on such methods, or do they prefer their own trusted insiders?
For sure, they work directly, and this has been published around a year ago. Hamas has been blocked. So Binance, this is where the story time. So Binance had begun their specific troubles around a year and a half ago when it was published that Binance has allowed certain Hamas actors to exchange money from cryptocurrencies into fiat currency on their platform in Gaza. This has been popped up an indication by the FCA. And then, as if it was some sort of, domino trail, all of a sudden Binance was blocked in the Netherlands. All of a sudden Binance was blocked in Germany. And once that began, I thought to myself, well, it's a matter of time until it happens in the state. A year into that, it happened around 2 weeks ago. They're under investigation. So if you look at terror organizations, such as Hamas and Hezbollah, they do it quite frequently. I think it was also published and it was released to the press around a month ago that the Israeli Ministry of Defense managed to not hijack, but play a whack-a-mole game with a few cryptocurrency addresses on the dark web, and they have locked it and they have liquidized that specific amount, which is lovely. But again, that doesn't solve the problem at the end of the day, because a terrorist can sit in Gaza, open a specific wallet account or a specific transaction that he wants to surpass. The ministry comes here, plays whack-a-mole, closes that specific wallet. But at the end of the day, you can open a new wallet in a matter of minutes and do it again. So I wasn't very impressed with that specific operation, but this is something that they're doing quite frequently. I know Hezbollah is doing the same. And I'm also aware of the fact that Hezbollah is also doing the same when it comes to transferring money into Iran to avoid the sanctions. So one of the things that they do, they receive cryptocurrencies and then funnel it, into Iran. This is also a method that has been published, and it's a known fact that they're doing. But again, in my opinion and the opinion of the State of Israel and other state actors, Hezbollah is a terrorist organization. Under the opinion of the European Union, I think up until a year ago, only the military sector within Hezbollah was considered a terrorist organization, but Hezbollah was only declared a proper terrorist organization by the Parliament, the European Parliament, if I'm not mistaken, around a few months ago. So the notion of defining a terrorist should be on the top priority of many financial actors and state actors.
Interesting, because Binance, I thought there was a significant level of Chinese ownership in that exchange, and in China, financial transactions are not completely free or without government oversight. So I'm curious to what extent allowing these terrorist Hamas-linked exchanges is also a matter of state policy in China, as opposed to just recklessness.
Well, I don't think it's under the Chinese administration's policy to enable Hamas to work on their specific platform. I think specifically in Binance, the issue is that their KYC checks are horrible and their onboarding process is extremely easy. A 2-year-old can onboard Binance. It's not a problem. So I think that was the issue, and because their checks and balances were very lenient, they ended up where they ended up. With that said, it doesn't mean that those specific companies, such as Binance, such as Coinbase, do not have personal liability.
Interesting. Well, financing is certainly a very big part of terrorism enablement, but there is also another aspect of it, which is, as we've briefly discussed previously, the maritime industry, the transference of goods and basically non-fiat support for terrorist activity. And you've mentioned that that has changed quite a bit in the last few years to the has changed so much that really it's become almost unrecognizable and difficult for law enforcement agencies to really kind of comprehend in this new operational environment. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So specifically in the maritime cargo sector, you need to bear in mind that you work specifically with ports. And these ports are usually state-owned or privately owned, but also with some sort of state involvement. And the issue of money laundering here and also terrorist financing comes to the point of the bill of lading. So a bill of lading is a document, okay? And this specific document shows you, it gives you a specific ownership over a good, okay? Let's say 1 ton of flour, 1 ton of grain, 1 ton of shoes. I love the example of shoes. It gives you some sort of ownership on that specific good. And on that bill of lading, there's usually a weight of how much the goods weigh. So if you receive a bill of lading for 1 ton of shoes that's supposed to be 1 ton, but then you receive a package the size of my cell phone, I think it pretty comes into being the fact that a specific money or specific, fund has been misused or has been not properly identified by the cargo handler and the bank. So if you take that a step forward and you look at the issue of cryptocurrencies, it's actually a very, it's a fictional show, but it's a show that maybe the listeners would like to watch. It's called, I think, Rough Diamonds, and it was aired on Netflix a while back on how the port of Antwerp has worked in a specific manner to launder money with drugs and the diamond industry. It's an entire drama. What's going on there within the specific diamond industry in Antwerp. But back to the example of cryptocurrencies, you usually see the issue in the payment. Okay, so because bills of lading are still fiat-based, they're the majority fiat-based, you do see the problem when it comes to when the fiat enters the bank. So when the cryptocurrencies are liquidized into fiat money and it's then transferred into the bank, and then you issue a bill of lading, that's a very easy method of money laundering, and that's usually done with cargo. That's one method of doing it, but this is because bills of lading today are not issued by cryptocurrencies yet, because cryptocurrencies have not been officially admitted as a currency globally. They're seen as a service, they're seen as a commodity, but not as a real currency, not as real currency that the bank can support.
Interesting, although there are now emerging blockchain banks, so I wonder if they'll be at the forefront of this activity.
I hope so. I sincerely hope so.
So at the end of the day, though, the cryptocurrency is not the only way by which terrorists support themselves. Otherwise, they could get stuck, especially because of the milk and bread.
The milk problem, yes. Everyone needs coffee with their milk. I'm sorry, milk with their coffee. I think that's the best example I can give.
One of the things that we have seen increase on both from state and non-state actors is the use of gold and more traditional chattel to essentially back their activity, because of the idea that the prices are preserved against inflation and financial fluctuations. What can you tell us about that?
Well, gold has been under the watchful eye of many regulators globally, specifically in the issue of terrorist financing. And I'll bring back the example of Hezbollah. One of the things that they do is actually with gold. So funny enough, another modus operandi that they have is that they publish a wallet on the dark web calling for donations. Then that specific cryptocurrency is being donated on that specific wallet, and then the cryptocurrency that has been donated on that specific platform is then being used to purchase gold and then the gold is being moved again. So as you can see, it's all being intertwined into one specific method, which is taking black money and turning it into white money within the realms of money laundering, while in the realms of terrorist financing, it's taking white money, turning it into black money, just with the example of gold. I know that gold has been a very hot topic, both for Europol and Interpol as well, also in the notion of human trafficking and the prevention of human trafficking as a payment method. But this is something that still has to be explored properly and still has to be researched more thoroughly.
Why do you suppose they prefer to rely on gold rather than cryptocurrency? And who uses cryptocurrency more often, and who uses gold and the like more often in terms of finance?
It's usually a combination. So usually when you look at terrorists, they don't put all their eggs in one basket, and they don't do all in gold or in cryptocurrencies. They do a combination. They partly buy gold and they partially buy cryptocurrencies, but even the purchase of gold is conducted via cryptocurrencies, so it can't be detected.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So cash is basically out as king, as we used to say, and
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yes. Also, if you look at the limits of cash today, governments have really limited the use of cash, and this is why you see an increase in inflow of use of gold and cryptocurrencies as a method to finance terror.
So basically, the rise of the centralized digital currencies is actually going to prompt also a correlation in the rise of cryptocurrency and gold rather than the other way around that some have hoped.
I actually had a very interesting discussion with this on a specific topic with my sister, as she asked me, well, once you have a CBDC, will that prevent the use of Bitcoin or USDT or whatever coin it is? And I said, well, once you privatize money, once you create a situation in which money is not specifically administered under a specific government or any government organization, it won't happen, because historically, as you look backwards, or post-mortem, as I call it, once you privatize something, you can't go back to the public sector. It will always be privatized. So just as much as Bitcoin has privatized the issue of currency, I do see the rise of CBDC as an option to make sure that specific currencies are administered better and cash will be less king. But once you have USDT and USDC and Bitcoin as a currency, it won't happen that they will be, stopped. It simply won't happen.
There's also the privacy concern. Many people have opposed the rise of the CBDCs precisely because of the concern of increased government surveillance of their transactions, not just the actual financial transactions, but in general their information passing through, and especially if the government is easily hacked and that information can then be traced by non-government groups externally, that becomes a problem. And that's why also more people may rely on alternative methods of payment.
Correct.
So in a sense, we're actually also creating our own problem, despite trying to solve it. We're trying to solve one problem, but creating another.
Just as much coal solved a lot of problems and created new problems, this new financial era that we're entering, this new industrial revolution that we're currently entering, will create new problems, but will solve the old problems.
Interesting. So going back kind of to the maritime industry in all of this, so we have seen a lot about illicit ships and ships trying to engage in all sorts of methods of obscuring the origin of whatever contraband they're using. And I mean, but given that all these methods are fairly well known and a lot of these ships are clearly unaccounted for, don't really belong to anyone in particular, if you look at how they register and so forth, why are these operations still so successful? What exactly is the industry missing that makes these smuggling operations and these operations to circumvent sanctions and things like that so successful?
Missing two main things. manpower, which they will never have enough.
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing, which I learned, unfortunately, is the fact that the money launderers and the terrorist financiers will always be ahead of the law. They will always find a new method to launder money. They will always find a new method to finance terror. As once you create a specific law and create it illegal, they will find a leeway. So even if you have the right manpower and you have the significant, task force to do it, you will never fully stop it, just as much as you're never fully able to stop crime. Because the nature of human beings, certain human beings, is to create terror, and this is what they do for a living. This is what they get up in the morning for. So for them specifically to find a new method to finance terror is just for me and you to open a Word document in the morning and draft a contract. That's the way they see it. I think one of the best ways to make sure that this phenomena is limited to an extent is to create better analytics tools of ships coming into port, better analytics tools of bills of lading. But for that, you need the indicators of people who worked in the specific, I call it gray areas, and are willing to share the information with the governmental authorities.
Mm-hmm. And to what extent has that been successful, or even a focus of that type of
Not
intelligence
successful.
gathering?
Not successful at all. I think it's mainly because of the fact that if you look into ships coming either into ports and globally, whether it is the port of Rotterdam or the port of Antwerp or any other port, not all ships are scanned, not all ships are checked for their cargo. I think around only 2% of the cargo is fully checked. It's quite easy to make sure that the cargo is misplaced. It's also quite easy to make sure that the specific cargo in certain instances is not picked up. They have several methods to do it. With that said, it's also very difficult to make sure that these specific analytics program are up to date, because you have to update them on a weekly basis. So specific indicators that were available a month ago will not be the same in a month from now. They have to be changed, checked, monitored on a weekly basis.
That's quite shocking, and we're talking about even relatively innocuous as we imagine it, at least European states imagine other parts of the world. I mean, in Africa you're constantly hearing about ships smuggling drugs, but I wonder if drug smuggling is just tip of the iceberg. First of all, some of these terrorist organizations use drugs for financing themselves, so that's part of the financial schemes anyway, but also things like gold coming from Africa and diamonds and whatever else. It seems like it's basically the Wild West right now.
No, I'll give you a different example that I've been taught when I just begun in this specific industry. Even if you take another tank, but even if you take a cargo of cigarettes and you sell it somewhere, and then you put it on a ship and you sell it someplace else, that is considered pure cash. Why? Because you can sell cigarettes everywhere. The same thing for alcohol. In my case, shoes. So it really depends on the cargo that you're selling itself. Because if cigarettes are considered cash, because it's so easy to sell, then imagine what's the case with alcohol or different kinds of commodities.
That's interesting. So sometimes smuggling doesn't look like smuggling, because people usually think of tons of cocaine or heroin, but in reality of fentanyl, for that matter. But many times it can successfully take an innocuous form that you wouldn't necessarily suspect to be anything illegal offhand.
True. Very, very true. Yes.
So what impact has that, especially the utilization of these innocuous, in themselves not illegal items, has had on insurance for shipping?
Well, maritime insurance as an insurance sector, it's a field within itself. First of all, you need to bear in mind that the ships have their own insurance, the cargo has its own insurance, every single part of the ship and every single part of the cargo has its own insurance. With that said, I didn't view, I think, with the past 2 or 3 years, any drastic changes in insurance, because I don't think the industry has developed to that.
Interesting. So we are still at the pre-production stage of development for all of this. I can imagine though that the prices could skyrocket once.
Correct, very correct, yes.
So imagine that it no longer becomes profitable to be involved in the maritime industry simply because of the insurance costs and risks affiliated with it. What happens then?
Then you move to a different method of transportation. You move to air transportation. You move to truck transportation.
That
Just
become-
because it didn't work in one specific method of transportation doesn't mean it won't work in the rest.
Well, that becomes a problem for fuel in particular because transporting fuel or through shipping routes seems to be much more efficient than through land routes for both security and logistical reasons. And those particular fuel tankers, oil tankers, have become also the source of obscuring financing. We have seen the exchanges between Iran and Venezuela and gold smuggling and assorted arms smuggling there, along with the fuel that's officially being transported. So I can't imagine. I can imagine, a time where much of the shipping industry, simply because of the cost, ends up in the hands of terrorists and assorted illicit actors. That's not a pretty thought to think about.
No, exactly not.
So, my question is, you've mentioned that the industries have been quite, and law enforcement and the combination of the two have been largely unprepared for these drastic and fairly recent changes. How can you tell us how does that work? Why have they been so unable to keep up with these changes, and what needs to happen next?
It comes again to the issue of indicators, because once you know how money is being laundered and how terrorism has been financed or will be financed, you just need to transport that specific information from the gray and black areas into the law enforcement areas. And not a lot of people are willing to do that for two reasons. The first reason is that they're being very well paid in the gray areas and black areas, and the second reason is because they're terrified to tell how these things work, because essentially once they do that, they snitch on their employers.
So there hasn't been a concerted effort to insert law enforcement agents into those areas the way it has been with the drug trade or whatever else.
True. What should be done here, I think, on a more global level, is to make sure that there's better cooperation, first of all, between the Egmont Group and the FATF, but also on the national level between the FIUs, to what extent they share information. This is part of also 6 MLD, the 6 Anti-Money Laundering Directive of the EU, on how they should share that information. But with that said, it also should be done on the member state level, on the state level itself, of members of states, I'm sorry, that are not part of the European Union, to what level they share information with other banks of the central banks. I don't see the Bank of Israel sharing information like that, for instance, with the Egyptian central bank or the Jordanian central bank.
So this level of first distrust and second, real challenges that prevent that sort of cooperation, that plays into the hands of these entities. So on the one hand, you're protecting yourself against misuse and corruption by the other party, but on the other hand, there's no way to get the information that you need or to get the other actors to block something that needs to be blocked in time due to this.
Precisely, yes.
Yeah. Can third parties be involved to facilitate this issue? For instance, using a European third party as a go-between between these two banks to cooperate?
In my opinion, you usually need advisors who are both trusted on, both minds. Just as much as I work in the Gulf and in Europe, and I help to some extent certain government organizations to facilitate their understandings, you need people to do that, precisely that, to make sure there's better negotiations between the organizations.
And do you see that becoming more of a trend, or do you see it's kind of not really happening at the moment?
I don't think it's happening to the extent it should happen.
Well, I don't want to keep you too long, but I do want to ask one major question, which is,
Go
what,
ahead.
we've talked about some of the new ground that has already happened and that we are completely unprepared for. But what do you
Mhm.
see coming next that hasn't yet happened that is going to disrupt this environment even more than it has?
Well, let me put it this way. In my specific industry, I've been named the Oracle. So certain financial institutions that go bankrupt, I usually foresee that the year in advance. Also certain trends in the market. So I was discussing the issue of pig butchering 6 months before people were actually viewing pig butchering as an industry in the fintech industry. What I will believe happen now is that we need to see how the market reacts to Mika. So now that Mika has been implemented on the European level, and you have a lot of member states in the European Union working on that, and you have a lot of association countries working with the European Union on those specific matters, and also money laundering instances that directly connected to terrorist financing, we need to see how the market reacts to Mika. In my opinion, it will be one of two ways. People will not comply fully, and they will request some sort of extended period to make sure that they will comply, and then it will be brushed off to a specific extent, or it will take the approach of GDPR and will all be fully regulated and fully being able to receive fines on those specific activities very soon. But again, we need to see how the market reacts to that.
Do you see any potential new technological disruption coming from the terrorist side that can new innovation that we haven't yet seen or that's only starting to emerge? Cryptocurrency is new, but not new. It's kind of already established as a method. The ship maritime industries are also have become sort of established as a practice. Just because we haven't caught up to it doesn't mean that it's not evolving. What do you see coming next? What method?
Well, in my opinion, the terrorism aspects will be more focused in prevention
Mm-hmm,
of being indicated in the analytics platforms, because I know a lot of law enforcement agencies work with analytics platform to
mm-hmm.
make sure specific indicators of terrorism pop up. They will work very closely to make sure they won't pop up. And for that, you will need experts who know exactly how they work also within money laundering to make sure that they are being pulled by the sea.
Can you see AI being used on the one hand
For sure.
to manipulate the data, to obscure the footprint, the digital footprint for these activities?
There will be, I think they will try. I'm not sure if it will be successful, but there will be a very good try. A very good effort will be made to that effect.
Yeah, as we talk about ChatGPT, I think more people think about it as a kind of a, you know, oh, well, will AI take us over? And less about how it's an algorithm that can be used to predict certain things. And just as the law enforcement can use it to predict uh, potential patterns of particular patterns and transactions, terrorists could use it as a predicting tool to circumvent the way the law enforcement is going on.
Correct. No, I do believe that there will be a very good effort to make sure they will at least try to surpass analytics platform. If they'll be successful or not, I think we'll have to view it in a bit and see.
Do you think that the crypto footprint that you have described, this tracing from the origin of the minting of the coin to the liquidation, can it be faked or obscured?
No, no, it's
Diverted?
on the blockchain. You can't fake it. If there's one thing you can't fake, is your tax. Well, if you launder your money, you can fake your tax reports. But essentially, you're not able to do that on the blockchain. Most definitely not.
Interesting. Interesting. I wonder if that's the next area for research. How can you create uh fake
Well, if we
blockchain?
mentioned it, I'm pretty sure people are thinking of it.
Yes, exactly. Well, thank you so much for this enlightening conversation. I think many people will now be thinking twice about the process of these transactions, and I think many of these questions about the shipping industry have not even occurred to the vast majority of people. I think what we're seeing being tracked in the news, all trackers, with obscured origin names, or oil that's been kind of mixed up in different places. That's just basically, that's only what we see. What we don't see is probably significantly more frightening.
Exactly.
Thanks to everyone who's been watching the program. We had a fascinating discussion with Ella Rosenberg, who is a EU regulatory consultant, and we will be back next week to track some other scary topic. I'm joking. This was the Washington Outsider Report. With you was Irina Zuckerman, and thank you for watching.